Before we get into the list, I would just like to get this out of the way. True Dracos will not appear on this list for two reasons. First of all, the pure build I don't think really makes the cut after the hits to Ignis Heat and Dynamite. Two, what remains of the deck is going to be an 8 or so card engine, which is splashed into other decks, and therefore I don't think it merits a spot by itself. With that being said, we can now move on to the list. This is my top 10 decks for the September 2017 format. Starting with the honorable mentions, we have Mermail Atlanteans and Psyframes. I think both of these decks benefit greatly from a slower format. Mermail's having a better chance of punching through opponents' first turn boards for the OTK, and Psyframes having a larger chance to build up card advantage over the opponent. I fully expect both of these decks to have regional tops, but they probably aren't topping YCSs or anything of that sort. Moving into the top 10, the 10th spot is Spiral. I think a lot of decks are deserving of this number 10 spot, but I'm giving it to Spiral partially because they're an up-and-coming deck, likely to be tier 0 once Double Helix comes out in the next set. Most of their combos revolve around attaching Last Resort to Sleeper. It's fairly strong, but I don't think they can really... I don't think they really deserve a spot higher on the list. The number 9 spot goes to Cosmo. Now, I think one of the main issues the deck has is lacking consistency in some places, or having very fragile opening plays, and only having one Dark Destroyer. Kaijus are still going to be relatively common. Board wipes were cracked down on a little bit. We only have one Dark Hole and one Kaiju Slumber now, but I still think they're fairly vulnerable to non-targeting cards. I also think some of their matchups against the decks higher on the list are relatively poor, and although it wasn't affected by Master Rule 4, it's just not, it doesn't really have all of the tools to deal with a lot of the other decks on this list. Next is World Chalice, and I think it's definitely the best of the Firewall Dragon spam decks. I think the ability to spam links is very powerful because most other decks are still stuck on Xyz and Fusions, which means that they have a huge heads up on making really powerful monsters. I think also that Rescue Rabbit coming to 3 is going to be a huge boon to the deck. It offers a lot more consistency. I think it's sort of a do or die deck in the sense that they have to have a good opening or they tend to fall flat on their face, which is why they're in the bottom half of the top 10 list. Still, I think it's a good deck to consider playing. I don't know how good it's really going to be once Spirals come out, but it's an interesting choice for now. My next deck is Burning Abyss Infernoid. I think this is probably the best variant of Infernoids. Arguably, Lightsworn is just as good, but personally, I think Burning Abyss is a little better. Infernoids unto themselves do not use the Extra X zone very often. Rarely do they make Tierra. And so I think that's good because it leaves open the Extra X spot for Burning Abyss or Lightsworn if you want to use those. Onunku and Deviati are very powerful main deck monster zone monsters. With very high attack, it allows them to OTK very easily. I think Void Feast is a ridiculously powerful card. And even if Infernoids are a little old, and let's face it, they're a bit power creeped, I think they have a lot of the tools to compete in this format. Next we have Pendulum Magicians. Now this is a deck that I didn't think would be very good, and then we got Wavering Eyes to 3. I think that adds a lot to the deck. It's 3 very powerful cards. Also, Luster Pendulum went to 2. I don't know how relevant that's going to be. since I don't really play Pendulum Magicians very much, but it has some pretty good opening plays. Now, I will say, if they don't have a fairly impressive opening play, they can fall flat on their faces, and they're going to have issues with cards like Dimensional Barrier and Unending Nightmare. But I think definitely, especially, I should say, at the beginning of the format, I think they'll have a lot of success before people start citing more heavily for them. Once they do, I think the deck will slowly decline. But for the first part of the format, like I said, I think it'll be a pretty strong contender. Next, we have Wind Witch Invoked. True Draco Invoked will also probably be a fairly significant variant, but I decided to go with the Wind Witch variant. I think it edges out True Dracos a little bit because it has more proven success. Wind Witches are very good at making link monsters. If you open Ice Spell, you can make a 3-link. Of course, Invoked have some very, very strong fusions as well. The deck is fairly consistent. The ceiling is maybe not quite as high as some other decks, but I think it's definitely a good all-around deck that will serve you pretty well. Next, we have Paleozoic Frogs. Now, I expected this deck to be higher on the list, but then True Dracos weren't totally killed. And so I think True Dracos are going to get splashed in some decks. Paleozoics still struggle to deal with Masterpiece, and that's going to be an issue, just quite frankly. I think that really hurts a lot of their matchups that may have been pretty easy before. Now they have to deal with the Masterpiece, and I think it levels the playing field in a lot of cases. Also, of course, we only have Grass at 1, so the 60-card variant is a little iffy. Most variants are probably going to be between 40 and 50 cards. I think that doesn't allow for as many tech cards. I don't think it's going to be quite as explosive. Of course, you can still play 3 Desires and 3 Card of Demise if you so choose. I think it's pretty much the strongest of the more fair decks, I would say. Totally Awesome is still a very strong card, but they aren't really able to make more than one Exceed right now. That will obviously change once Mastar Boy comes out in Circuit Break. But for now, this is what we have. In our number 3 spot, we have Trickstars. Now, Trickstars are a deck that in some ways I wanted to put higher, but couldn't really justify it. Their ability to disrupt the opponent's hand, especially if they have Droll and Lockbird, just sending their entire hand, we're getting rid of their entire hand and not allowing them to replace it, is basically almost an instant win condition. They're very good at making links. They burn for a lot of damage. There's a lot of cases where they don't even really have to attack. They can just burn you to death. It's a really interesting and unique deck that has a lot going for it. It had success in the previous format, even when there was Zoo and True Draco. I expect it to continue to have success, and now that the format is slower and the decks aren't quite as overpowered, I think they'll be a very, very strong contender at regionals and YCSs. In our number 2 spot, we have Zombie Lightsworn. I think this is definitely the best variant of Lightsworn's. Cards like Shiranui Solitaire are incredibly strong. I think this might be one of the more consistent decks on this list. I think it has a pretty high ceiling, some really strong combos. I think it does struggle with Masterpiece a little bit, which probably kept it from being in the number 1 spot. But again, it's very consistent. It has a lot of very strong combos. And I think a lot of decks lower on the list are going to struggle immensely against them. I just don't think they can keep up in card advantage, and Lightsworns will quite frankly just overwhelm them. In our number 1 spot, we have ABCs. Now, the tiebreaker here between them and Lightsworns is that I think True Dracos are more splashable in this deck, which beefs up some of their matchups. Again, against Lightsworns, also against Paleo, which ordinarily would be an awful matchup, which they would lose quite often. I just think it's a huge bonus. And of course, it was already a pretty strong deck. Dragon Buster is really strong. The ability to banish your opponent's cards is pretty ridiculous in a slower format. A common theme with a lot of these decks is that the slower format really helps them, as I'm sure you've noticed. But I think ABC's being fairly normal summon dependent, using Union Hanger to search a monster, you normal summon it. I think that's something that belongs more in a slower format. I think ABC's really fit the bill, I would say, quite well. And I think that pretty much wraps up the list. So until my next video, I'll see you guys later. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more Yu-Gi-Oh content from me. See ya.